First of all, thank you for having me back. Much has changed, but actually quite a bit that hasn't changed either. Indeed, what Ms. Applebaum was just speaking about, right? The conditions in Ukraine, I feel like have been pretty stable in a terrible place for too long. Different between, not that much between President Trump's first term and his second term. President Trump, I think, is more confident in this term. When he came into office, I always describe President Trump's first term as it was kind of a come-as-you-are party, right? He didn't think he was going to win. By the way, I was brand new too. I was a machine shop owner in Wichita, Kansas. He'd done New York real estate. This time, I would describe it as I've seen this movie before. And so he now...
You haven't seen it quite as action-packed, surely, as this time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
This has been a whirlwind, hasn't it?
No, people forget how action-packed his first term was as well. And you also forget that he was impeached twice in his first term, very much slowing down some of the activity that he would have liked to undertake, but was unable to because he was... But
surely it's true that he came better prepared this time.
Yes, he was better prepared. The team around him, I think it's fair to say, was better prepared. It's worth noting, right, the folks that he picked at the most senior level, at the cabinet level, none of whom, with one exception, had served in the executive branch before. Linda McMahon was in the first one and now is in the Department of Education. So it's a new team, and he is the only one who was in that first term. And so, yes, he came in with the same set of commitments. He campaigned in the second campaign just as he did. By the way, he would tell you he won 3 times. Right?
Of course he would.
Yeah. He campaigned in each of those 3 campaigns on the same set of priorities for the United States.
Yeah. So if I could ask you, Joakim Reiter, what do you see as Europe's most urgent strategic priority, and how can the private sector help?
So I think there's a slight sort of Trump Tourette going on in Europe, a lot of focus on that. But the reality is that while Europe is quite anxious, not least because of the tariffs, it will hollow out the industrial base. We're already going through a cost of living crisis. Tariffs per definition drives up inflation. So it's a difficult period for Europe. And not to mention, which Anne also referred to, we're at war. This is not a soft conflict or a hybrid war that's going on our continents. It's a proper war. So Europe enters into a volatile phase with already some serious homework to do. And I understand Dr. Draghi referred to that in a very, very good way. And I think the Draghi report aligns very well with what the private sector expects from Europe, which frankly, number one, take control of your own security, don't rely on others. Actually, you need to figure out in your defense spending, in your posture, how to make sure that you can secure your own continent, your own nations, which is now, to give Trump credit, he has been pushing Europe on that for a long time, and you can see the outcome of the NATO summit, which from a private sector perspective is positive, and that includes, by the way, critical national infrastructure and civilian defense. Europe is embracing back to how we thought about it during Cold War with the total defense doctrine. Second is competitiveness. There is no way that Europe will be able to afford the type of spending that we're envisaging unless we crack the productivity and growth dilemma that we have faced for not the last few years, for a very long time. We talk about underinvestment for a very long time. We have supply side constraints. We have lack of structural reforms. And the private sector is, I would say, united in its how would I describe it? In its thumbs down on European policymakers and its demand for a radical rethink of economic policy.
I don't know how much of the previous conversation you were here for with Mario Draghi and Mr. Mytilineos, but obviously this is a core element of the Draghi, the core of the Draghi report and the core demand, and it's early days, but do you see any signs that Europe is getting more serious about this?
So if you take it from a private sector perspective or an outside-in perspective, I'm no longer in government, I served 20 years in government. Remember, the Letta and the Draghi report were written before Trump got elected, before a tariff war. So if logically, with the recipe that he provided, which, and by the way, personally, I don't agree with everything that he says or recommended, but I would say he's 80% right. And by the way, that's good enough.
Okay.
So, since Trump got elected, the CEO confidence across Europe, and that's the European Roundtable of Industrialists, is hit rock bottom. It's never been so low. So we're talking about the peak of the COVID lockdowns. That's the level of CEO confidence investing in Europe today. So if anything, post-Trump election, post increased volatility in the world economy, you would imagine that Europe would double down on economic reforms based on the recipe that it had even prior to the further destabilization of the global economy. And it hasn't. So I think the frustration that the private sector has is
so
that
not enough sense of urgency?
No, not enough sense of urgency. There's a lot of good talk, but I think Europe is consulting itself to death on policy reforms.
What about the one factor that was mentioned, which was the arrival, that somewhat shifts the balance, the arrival of a new government in Germany? Do you see that as
I think that's a very, I mean, as Vodafone, we worked really well with Olaf Scholz's government, so I'm not going to comment on who should have won the election. But I would say in terms of the resolve and the decisiveness, and also Germany being back at the driving seat in Europe, demanding European reforms. Because in all honesty, in the world that we live in, it's logical for national governments in Europe to think, oh, I need to fix my own home base. And surely there's a lot you can do locally. But Europe's fundamental problem is one lack of scale. And lack of scale is driven by excessive fragmentation. So you have to address the European dimension.
So you can start to see a little bit of a motor attached to this thing. Mike Pompeo, Trump tariffs, good policy, bad policy?
I'm not a big fan of tariffs, personally.
Actually, The Economist isn't funny enough. You'd be surprised to learn.
Having said that, I'm not a fan of European tariffs on America, non-tariff barriers on America. I'm not a fan of the Chinese Communist Party's massive subsidization, dumping of its products. I could go through a list of things that I worry about far more than American tariffs. If we're looking for global GDP growth, the tariffs that the United States will put on will have a relatively small impact. I actually don't view them as particularly inflationary. It's a one-time price adjustment. It's a rebalancing. And I'm happy to talk about this more. But I mean, I was with President Trump when we were working through this the first time. I would quadruple the tariffs on the Chinese Communist Party, and I would not come at Europe in the same way that he has. But by the same token, he's tried to cajole other nations into dropping all of their non-tariff barriers. He's tried to convince them that reducing their tariffs would be useful for them, for their own economies. And for a host of political reasons. I get, believe me, I was in Congress. I get domestic politics. You want to protect the farmers in France. I get it. But these are a set of policies that have impacted America's capacity to export, build our businesses in the United States, and President Trump's trying to rebalance that. I'm convinced, and I think we're starting to see this. I think as other nations see that President Trump is serious about this, they'll reduce some of their both tariff and non-tariff barriers in a way. And that President Trump will respond accordingly.
Okay, so you're going to see a lot of deals coming through now, do you think? Do you expect a flurry? Because they seem to come more slowly than perhaps advertised at the beginning on the trade front.
That's been the story of my life. I don't know about yours. I'm often quite ambitious, but don't always accomplish things on the timeline that I would hope. I don't know if there'll be a flurry of deals. It depends on how nations respond. Right? In the end, deals take two parties to achieve. It's not just one party, and so I don't know. We'll see. By the way, I hope these deals are not just paper tigers. I hope they're real. I hope they are deep, well-documented legal structures with penalties if nations don't actually deliver on the commitments that they have made. And I hope that they are at scale. I hope the net result is more productivity, more growth, lower barriers, more trade, global trade. If we get, with one exception, with the exception of China, I hope that that's the case. If so, Ms. Applebaum was talking about Putin's vision of the United States or the West in decline. If we get this right, it won't be true. And if we get this wrong and we allow China continue to advance its economic interests all across the globe, Xi Jinping and Putin will be right. And our dreams of democracy and freedom will have been wrong.
I'd just be curious to know whether you think that this what you've just heard on tariffs is too relaxed from a European perspective. Does it seem as sort of no big of a deal as this seems?
Full disclosure, I spent 20 years as a trade negotiator. So I'm seeing the system that we carefully built over 8 years being dismantled in front of our eyes. And there are two different aspects to that. and by the way, I'm not talking here as Vodafone. Vodafone is basically locked into national cage in terms of our regulation. Right. So we're not really affected by tariffs. We're affected by sanctions, entity listing, and other things that, including where during your term, that was imposed. We're affected from a supply chain perspective, but largely we're a non-tradable service. Not by choice, but by design by policymakers in Europe. That being said, I want to highlight two different things. One is the international trading system, and I'm not referring to WTO only, I'm talking about bilateral free trade agreements, international interdependence, is basically an insurance system. And rule of law is super important to maintain predictability. The number one ingredient of success for any corporate sector is predictability. We often talk about, is the return on capital profile correct? What's the service revenue growth in the market? But all of that is adds on the Maslow's ladder of needs, where the need number one is predictability, rule of law. So if you have US behavior that seems to dismiss the principle of rule of law of international trade, that poses significant problems for private sector investment. Because we naturally, when things are unpredictable, we hold back investment. So that's point number one, which is why you may trigger recession over and above the inflationary effects. Second thing is on tariffs. So tariffs in itself, like again, Vodafone is not particularly affected. But just let's be honest, inside the European Union, the tariff equivalent on, say, telecom services delivery is higher than anything that is between the US and the EU, including agricultural goods. So there is a lot of trade barriers. Most of them are not actually by design to filibuster with the Americans. If so, we wouldn't have the largest digital trade deficit on the planet with US companies, which we do. So if you want to go trade deficit sector by sector, we can unpack that, but that would, just be blunt, that would imply that Europe would then have full legitimacy for a far more protectionist policy on US tech companies, which I wouldn't advocate because they bring capabilities, and I believe in transatlantic collaboration where we bring our comparative advantages and leverage the US technology advancements, which has been amazing and benefit European productivity. But the mindset of trade balancing leads us in a very different world, and one that fits poorly with heavily interdependent supply chains that we have built in the corporate sector for at least 4 decades, that we are now rethinking on what we need to do with them. And that actually is very dangerous territory.
So in the world of, on the theme of unpredictability, one of the things that, again, Anne Applebaum was saying was not entirely predictable was that President Trump would decide to bomb Iran. You were Iran must have taken up an awful lot of your time as Secretary of State. You were overseeing a policy of maximum pressure on Iran, and now here we are in a new phase. I think everybody would be very interested to hear your sense of where things have got to, the extent of the damage that has been done to Iran's nuclear program, and critically, what happens next?
You bet. First of all, full disclosure, the Iranians are still trying to kill me, so I'm hopelessly biased.
And Trump withdrew your security.
I don't have a government-funded security detail with me today, that's true. I was unsurprised by President Trump's strike. In the same way that the rationale for the Iranians trying to chase me when we took the strike on Soleimani, this was in response to the fact that we were losing deterrence, right? The U.S. Embassy in Baghdad had artillery fired on it just about every night for a period of time. In 2019, September 14, 2019, the Iranians fired directly out of Iran into Saudi Arabia ballistic missiles at a Aramco facility, coming close to killing Americans. And so we were losing deterrence. Deterrence is it's always ephemeral, right? It's always temporary. President Trump did what 2 previous presidents had declined to do. He went after the number 2 Iranian official, a legend, a fellow named General Soleimani, and restored that deterrence. We didn't have another artillery round fired at our embassy after that. Chairman Kim took note in North Korea. Xi Jinping took note. They could see that President Trump was a different cat, so to speak, which was all to the good for the world's security. By the way, the Europeans told us not to take the strike. Everybody, by the way, much of the U.S. Defense Department didn't want to take the strike. There was just a handful of us who believed that it was essential to restoring America's place to be the deterrent force in the Middle East. That strike actually unlocked what became the Abraham Accords. Fast forward to today. For 4 years, President Biden basically, he didn't undo the sanctions, but he ceased to enforce them in any material way, allowing the Iranians to become incredibly wealthy again. Went from less than $3 billion of foreign exchange reserves to somewhere on the order of $30 to $36 billion of Forex by the time President Biden left office. And you could see the effect. And then, of course, we had October 7th of 23, where the Israelis made a decision that was fundamentally different than the one they had made before as well, which was, how to put it inelegantly, no more bullshit. We are not going to live under threat of 10,000 precision-guided missiles in Lebanon. We're not going to live with the Hamas guys with a tunnel network that rivals any tunnel network anywhere in the world. We're going to go provide for our own security. And so they did. They diminished Hamas. They diminished Hezbollah. I used those descriptors intentionally. Neither of those threats is gone. Syria fell, much to Vladimir Putin's chagrin and much to the Ayatollah's pain. And between Israel and the United States, we reduced the capacity of the Houthis to take commercial vessels, including Greek commercial vessels, and hold them ransom. And then within these past few weeks, President Trump, in spite of his best efforts to convince the Iranians they had to cease enrichment, something that was the policy from the first term as well, they continued down their merry path, and President Trump, following significant Israeli efforts to diminish Iran's capability, not only its scientists, but its air defense systems and some other targets more broadly, President Trump sent American resources and assets, formally, and our young men and women into harm's way, and went after 3 targets inside of Iran. Setting the program back, we'll have to all go see the full extent. As someone who lived in the intelligence world, I'm confident that it was really important, but not sufficient, because it's never sufficient.
So hence the critical thing of what happens next, I
Yes,
guess.
look, here's the answer to that. So long as the Ayatollah is in power, this is temporary. Right, so long as just as Ms. Applebaum described Vladimir Putin as unchanging in his ideology and his objectives, his to build an imperial Russia, the Ayatollahs to create a hegemonic Islamist power, maybe a global Islamist.
So does that mean the real strategic aim for Israel and the United States has to be regime change, which has been
in my view, that's of course yes. If you want to have Europe less at risk or the United States less at risk, forget Israel for a moment. If you want those 2 places to be less at risk, something has to change in Iran, and whether that's a replacement for the Ayatollah, or he finds Jesus or Muhammad or whoever it is he finds, right? Which I think is incredibly unlikely. You will have to remain hard at this. He will attempt to rebuild every element of power that he has been set back on, whether it's his terror proxies, his standing in the world, his nuclear capabilities and program. Every one of those has been greatly diminished. He is embarrassed inside of his own country, clearly with the leaders, although I think the Iranian people probably don't know the full extent of the loss that they had. He is determined to rebuild and will effort to do so.
What do you see in terms of the European? I mean, we've been bystanders to this. We tend to come in at the negotiation stage if there are negotiations. What's the European role, and how can Europe position itself in this sort of volatility with major powers in the Middle East?
Not so sure we should, if I have to be perfectly honest. This is clearly something that the U.S. position has well formulated. You're right. We tend to come
steer well out of it?
Yeah, Europe is a lot of things, but we tend to be better at economic diplomacy than security diplomacy, partly because also we don't have a common stance. Plus, remember, our allies, in our case, which is an existential threat for Europe, we have our own challenges along the eastern border. And so I think personally I would focus on that, and if there is a need for the US or Israel for Europe to play a role, they will tell us when it's appropriate. I honestly don't see what we can do that would make any difference at this point in time.
So you mentioned the eastern border, and we heard from Anne Applebaum a sense that maybe there was an open question still about how President Trump would have ultimately come down on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. You've seen that close up. What do you expect to happen there?
Goodness, I expect he will continue to try and get a ceasefire there, which he's been, that the world has been unsuccessful at. Right? Frankly, we've had Minsk I, Minsk II. There's not much new on that. I remember so vividly the whole world describing Donald Trump as a Russian asset. I almost heard her say the same thing today. Shouldn't use those terms, but she did before in many ways. I found that that wasn't my experience as his Secretary of State. It's worth.
He has been very careful about what he says about Vladimir.
Yes, he's always very careful, and he uses language, right? He's done the same thing with Chairman Kim. He talked about his love letters. That his model is why should I personally attack these leaders when I'm punishing them? I mean, we punish the Russians. It's worth noting, just as I don't use the same language President Trump does. He says this war wouldn't have happened had he been there. I don't use that language. But it didn't happen when he was there, right? Vladimir Putin took a fifth of Ukraine under Barack Obama, 0% under Donald Trump, and went at it again a few months after we left office. I see some smiles in the audience. You laugh if you will. But if you're a Ukrainian kid or a mom with a young Ukrainian daughter, did you prefer the deterrence model that was successful or the one that launches missiles every night into Ukraine for 4 years following February of 2022? I would argue for the former, not the latter. It was the missiles that Donald Trump provided to Ukraine that saved Kyiv on those fateful nights, not the ones Barack Obama refused to provide to him. And so we do need to reset the fact base in everybody's mind. I get that people don't like the language President Trump uses about Vladimir Putin, but the model, I think, worked. And I would argue that we saw this manifest these last couple of weeks with both the G7 summit and the NATO summit, where the Europeans committed to spending more. I hope I'm wrong, but I'd probably take the under on that number. If history is any guide, they will be slower and less willing to part with their hard-earned money to actually go deliver for their own security. I pray that I'm wrong about that. But if we get that right, then Putin will see that what happened. He watched that NATO summit. I'm convinced it was disheartening to him. He was hopeful that they would walk away angry at each other, uncommitted to each other, with some doubt about President Trump's commitment to Article 5. None of those three things happened during that summit. And so I hope Putin will receive that message and shape his policies in accordance with that. And then I hope all of us collectively in the West will go deliver a win for Ukraine. My critique of President Biden was he patted himself on the back for saving Kyiv after they lost thousands of lives. We should not pat ourselves on the back for how we behaved with respect to Europe. Right? Europeans shouldn't pat themselves on the back and say, look, after he invaded Ukraine, look what we did. That's a fail. Right? Deterrence failed. And so now we have to restore that deterrence. We have to go build it back collectively. I think there's a model. I think there's a path forward. Probably don't have time to go into it, but I think we can. And we must. Putin must be viewed in the world as having lost. That is really important. It's important for the people in Wichita, Kansas, who I represented for 6 years, to have Putin viewed as losing in the eyes of the world gives us a better model, a better hope for deterrence.
I think that's an important thing to hear from you. I'm not sure we would hear those words or that sentiment from Donald Trump, would we?
Yeah. Okay. It's probably could be. I think he knows too who needs to have lost. I assure you, if you ask him, does he want to win or Putin to win, he would say he wants to win, wants to prevail. Right? I'm confident of that. He might not use the same language. We often use different words, but I would not draw from that difference in language any less of an understanding about the absolute necessity of an outcome in which Vladimir Putin is perceived not to have succeeded in nearly all of his objectives. It may be that there's one or two that he was after that are hard to get back in the short run. You think of some real estate problems, right? Very, very hard to figure your way through those. I'm a realist as well. But if we get a security architecture that gives us another 25 or 40 years, that will be well done on the part of all of us, on the part of the United States and Europe.
And that is for Europe the question of stability, security, resilience. Surely is what is in the wider European interest too, isn't it, for business as well?
Yeah, I mean, Europe is going through a very, very rocky road of learning the hard way what matters, and better late than never, in my view, frankly, on this point. Just so you know, Vodafone, we don't own an operator in Ukraine, but we have Vodafone Ukraine. We were there having to evacuate women and children, standing at the border post, transporting them to different capitals across Europe to give them a new life. We were there to give donations to Vodafone Ukraine to rebuild base stations that have been bombed to the ground by Russian clear targeting of civilian infrastructure. So it's been a very, very, very difficult journey, but also which is less talked about and less acknowledged openly by the current U.S. administration, is that we're already in a very, very hot hybrid warfare. We're getting constant attempts of cyber attacks. Now, Vodafone, of course, have adapted with the times, but this is a fantastic illustration of what resilience means for Europe. Increasingly, we have to recognize, which I think the US has been better at historically than us, which is if you take the ingredients of resilience, which is basically how competitive are you? Secondly, how secure are you? And third, how well do you leverage technology for your resilience? These are the three ingredients of any resilience mix you want to build. Europe is behind on a number of key technologies that drive both military and civilian defense capabilities. AI, I understood Mario Draghi referred to AI. I would argue the whole 5G, 6G, and all these highways that you run your modern economy on, we're behind on. And we're way behind China on this, and which should be a concern for everyone. On competitiveness, we have a huge problem, and security we've invested for a long time. So to be perfectly honest with you, we're waking up from a pretty nightmarish night. We're probably all slightly beaten up. But this is the point where we have to rise to the challenge as Europeans. And looking to someone to do it for us is absolutely wrong. There must be an end to that, looking for someone else to try to avoid us dealing with our self-imposed handicaps, because this is purely by our own making. So I think from a private sector point of view, that's what's important. I would say, however, it becomes a distraction to have a discussion around does Article 5, and as a Swede, that's a very important issue, having recently joined NATO, having a discussion around what does the US want with Greenland in the midst of having an Eastern Front war. That's not the type of conversation where you want to waste political capital, let alone bandwidth on, at the point of time that we're at as Europeans. And which is why I think a lot of Europeans, including in sort of kitchen tables, are debating what the hell does this mean for us? And is that lack of predictability of the alliances, which I agree with you in terms of the actual outcomes of the NATO summit, seems to nullify some of the rhetoric, but rhetoric does matter in Europe.
Was the Greenland thing a constant theme in your tenure? It did come up a bit.
Yes.
But are you surprised that it's reared its head to the extent that it did so early on in the Trump second administration? No. So you think this is a deep driver of Donald Trump, or this sort of...
I should speak about my personal experience on this issue. Our mission set was to build a deeper security architecture in Greenland for all things north, if you will. It's a bit of a shorthand. I apologize for that, especially with the Swedes sitting here. Things north matter. I get it. And by the way, we cared deeply about that. I went to the Arctic Summit.
Which I agree with. But
yeah, I literally went to the Arctic Summit, and you would have thought I had a deadly disease by how the European foreign ministers treated me. For the Arctic Summit, it's all the Arctic nations, including Russia. So Foreign Minister Lavrov was there. For years and years and years, it talked only about climate. Literally, go read those communiques for years and years and years, and it's all about green and rising sea levels. I don't want to debate climate change. But there was nothing about security, literally nothing. And I had decided, no, we're not going to do that anymore. I'm going to talk about security. And I literally thought, oh my gosh, I need a security team for my colleagues. Yeah. And so I think if you ask me what Donald Trump's really trying to drive at, I think this is true with the Canadians and his concept that he's talked about a couple times, the Golden Dome, right? It's how do we have mostly, and you talked about taking a holiday in Europe. We did the same in some ways in the United States in the 90s as well. Most of our air defense systems are aimed at Russian structures, Russian capabilities. The world has moved on, and we all need to collectively figure out how to do this well. One more thing on communications, and this gets a little bit too. So we went after Huawei as hard as we could during my time. We picked that. You were speaking about a fellow who was my undersecretary for economic affairs. He and I chose that because it was symbolic of the technology risks associated with all things Chinese Communist Party, and it was very visible and deep. So it had a rhetorical element to it. What I always joke with is I was Ericsson's best salesman ever, by far. If I got a commission for every set of Ericsson equipment I sold, I might not be here. I might be enjoying the beach right now. Europe had a tech stack that we didn't have. I wasn't flacking for American business. I was flacking for Western communications architecture and security. Yeah. In the same way that I think what President Trump is getting at there is we do have to develop this Western security architecture, including things that NATO's going to need to do along its northern boundary. And
I think many people in Europe would understand that, would get that now, and have to
some
extent woken up to that.
I get the tweets are that Europeans find the tweets annoying. Well,
no, but it's
message received.
But I wanted to. It's not so much that. It's the question of territorial expansion or ownership, and that's. You mentioned Canada. That also affected Canada. It's not just the Europeans, the Canadians, and the current Canadian Prime Minister reacted extremely negatively with that and won an election on the back of it. So maybe he should thank Donald Trump for that. But it's a serious question. It leads people to question. Is America our friend when it's saying we should be part of America, or is America our friend when it says we need to grab part of that currently territory that is under a Danish sovereignty? Or is it just something else going on? Is it just part of opening people's eyes to the strategic importance of these places?
Yeah. My view with this, I remember when President Trump tweeted about my red button is bigger than your red button, and the whole world went high and right. I could go through I can do the greatest hits with the best of them. Watch the through line has been my learned experience. It's there's a lot of noise. That noise gets amplified by people who continue to suffer from Trump derangement syndrome. It is real. It's not in DSM-4 yet, but stand by. Right? People who they can't just step back and stare at the reality of, by the way, the successes and the failures. We had many failures in the Trump administration. We didn't get the nuclear weapons out of Chairman Kim's hands. Hong Kong fell on my watch. It breaks my heart that we collectively, the Brits and us primarily, weren't able to do more. So it's not about a blind view of President Trump and all success. No, we had many things that we tried and didn't work. But my view is, don't take my word for it. But if you want to be able to understand what it is the United States is going to do, just stare at the through line, stare at the policy things. Right? It's a bit international, a bit domestic. President Trump is going to close the southern border. Write it down. But not because of his tweets, but because he believes deeply that affects American sovereignty and security. And he's going to do his best until the courts get in his way and stop him, as they did in our first term. He will push that. He will push the boundaries there as far as he can. I would take every policy vertical, and you should take the through lines from his first term, the things he did, and frankly, the things we've seen now in the first coming on 6 months, and just kind of take the noise down.
So the through line on Greenland, for example, for a Nordic, what would that be? Should we? I find that quite. I mean, I do understand what you're saying, and I think that's a sensible interpretation for the world. But it's hard, when you apply it to somewhere like Greenland, is it not? If you're sitting in the Nordic region.
So you're really pushing me away from my day job and into my nationality, and I'm half Danish, by the way, so it adds a particular twist to the conversation.
Deeply personal.
Yeah, it's deeply personal.
Yes.
I think remember we have the Thule bases that the U.S. had been running at Denmark's approval for a long time. I think it's fair to say that some European countries, not all, certainly not the Nordic countries, have underestimated the security dimension of the Arctic Circle and the manner in which, with melting icebergs, the manner in which there will be attempts of grabbing both raw materials but also controlling it from a security domain perspective. And so is there anything wrong with raising the security profile of the Arctic Circle through the Arctic Summit and through other collaborations? No. Is unilateralism the way to do it, especially towards allied countries? I would humbly disagree, and I say that this is probably the worst strategy you could have if you wanted Denmark to play ball, or Norway, or Sweden, which, by the way, all of them would be willing to play ball. So I think you're creating, which was referred to before, in the end, a lot of the autocrats that we're having as strategic adversaries, they look for divide and conquer. This is unfortunately playing into their hand. So it may not be the intention, but that's how it's been perceived on the European side. And that's not helpful from a security perspective. However, should we all think about the Arctic Circle way more from a security perspective, including European perspective? Absolutely. And is the US leading the way there? Absolutely. And they've been doing that for some time, including when you got involved in the Arctic Summit. So I do want to pick up on one point that you mentioned as well, which is technology. Because I think that as Europeans, we often extremely underestimate that. And part of that is, well, I think there is still a fallacy in Europe that the state plays a much more prominent role for the advancement of technology than what it ever did, and certainly at this time. If you look at military capability or what I would call total defense capability, just take Ukraine as a fantastic case study, and I would advise everyone to study the journey that country has been on. The manner in which they leverage technology is not through large state interventionist programs. It's basically leveraging private sector capabilities to the max, many of which were not intended for military use. Cyber defense of Ukraine, Microsoft has done a fantastic job. There is no way that Ukraine would have been able, and they're very advanced in cyber defense, to defend themselves as well in the absence of the partnership with Microsoft. So there is a fundamental question for us Europeans is, how do we unshackle ourselves from some of our past understanding on how you drive technological advancement? And by the way, we should have learned the lesson from COVID, where innovation in terms of the vaccines is, again, a story around private sector ingenuity. So how do you unleash that? And for me, I'm very worried that Europe is not moving fast enough.
An old mindset.
And not moving fast enough. I give you one example, and we get very focused on US players. Vodafone is one of the leading providers of satellite connectivity, and we're leading the pack on direct-to-device connectivity. We're one of the leading providers of subsea cables. Why would a state come up with a subsea cable strategy without having Vodafone around the table? I mean, we have 1 million kilometers of subsea cables. We represent 20% or so of the world's internet. You can't devise a strategy on subsea cable without having the private sector on board. And that's not only us, that's Alcatel-Lucent, that's Orange. So the culture in the US is much more to basically invite the private sector in and leverage their capabilities. There's too much of an arm's length approach in Europe to be able to capture the benefits of cutting edge technology for state objectives and security objectives. And I think that's one of the key things that we're going to have to relearn very, very quickly as Europeans.
May I just take 1 second to amplify that? There is no chance that the CIA director of the United States of America or the chiefs of intelligence services for, and by the way, our Norwegian partners, our Danish intelligence partners, really good, really capable, but there's no chance that any of them, or take it out of the intelligence space, the military capabilities, have a prayer of competing in the security space absent amazing work by companies like as Vodafone as an exemplar, right? It is literally the case that the United States has successfully outsourced our technological innovation for security for coming on 20 years now, perhaps, where we really kind of realized taxpayers couldn't, it wasn't about could taxpayers write big enough checks. It was about government being incapable of innovating at the speed that was necessary. And so we got better. But in space, we can see it with SpaceX, right, who came and just crushed Boeing and Lockheed. And by the way, I'm less interested in the competitive element of that from a commercial perspective when I was in government, but the capacity to actually do what we needed to get these satellites up from a security perspective was imperative and couldn't have been done without marshaling the massive resources that sit in this room, the commercial actors that sit in this room. Europe needs to get this more right, better. I'll be less critical than you. You know more about it than me. But we all in the West need to do that. If we're going to confront this challenge from the Chinese Communist Party, government needs to provide direction and some resources, but in the end, that innovation will take place in security spaces with amazing commercial partners, just as is happening on the battlefield in Ukraine today.
I want to turn to one topic which is you've alluded to many times, which is clearly very important, which is China. Clearly, we should be, as you've sort of implied, spending a lot more time on China and a lot less time on some of the other things that are preoccupying us. Have we been distracted from the China? I know that the United States is very laser focused on China, but Europe perhaps has a different attitude. What is your assessment of the state of play on the strategic challenge of China?
In terms of focus?
In terms of getting serious about the strategic rivalry with China, I guess.
Yes, I actually don't think any of us are sufficiently focused, including the United States, sufficiently focused yet. And it's complicated and multifaceted. This for me, so it's not about Taiwan. We often talk about China in context of Taiwan. We should deter them, Xi Jinping, from taking Taiwan. I'm convinced we collectively can do that, at least a kinetic military confrontation in Taiwan. But the real problem with the Chinese Communist Party is they're inside the gates. It's not about, by the way, they have a capable military. I'll bet they're not as good as they think they are. I'll bet Xi Jinping, when he saw Putin fail, went to his generals too and said, come on, what can we really do? And by the way, what happened in Iran would suggest to Xi Jinping, again, that military leaders will lie to your face if the risk is that they get thrown in jail for the rest of their lives. Right. But they have a very capable space program. What they have really done is they have used their commercial power to convince nations that you can't actually push back against the Chinese Communist Party. It's true in the United States. For 40 years, our policy was engage in China, invest in China, they'll become more like us. This was Dr. Kissinger's model after 1972. And while, Dr. Kissinger and I had this debate many times, I never convinced him I was right and he was wrong. And that always that always made me very nervous because he's a lot smarter than me. But he by 2022 he was wrong about this model, and I wish it wasn't so. I thought those 1.4 billion people had autonomy, agency, and could actually do things necessary. Xi Jinping fundamentally changed that. He drove a security state intent on undermining our model, our way of life. You talk about these international systems. You could argue that from time to time the United States pushes on them too. Xi Jinping has completely obliterated nearly every international institution in the world today. And I'd say that I could, if you gave me 6 hours, I could lay it out for you jot and tittle. The United Nations, the World Bank, the World Intellectual Property Organization. Think about it. Some of you didn't even know it existed. You do. The Chinese Communist Party runs the joint. The World Intellectual Property Organization, the single largest thief of global intellectual capital over the last 20 years, is now essentially running the international body charged with protecting international intellectual property. That is nutso for us all to sit back and allow that to have happened, and we all did. And so there's not enough focus. Xi Jinping's, he's going to fail. We're just so you know, the bottom line is we're going to win, but it's going to take enormous effort. And when I hear Europeans say, we don't want to pick a side, this was a common refrain. You guys are duking it out. We don't want to pick a side. I would tell you, Xi Jinping has picked a side. and it ain't yours. So this isn't about the United States versus China. This is about property rights, human dignity, and freedom. And everyone has to pick a side on those concepts. And I know the side that you are all on, and we all need to get after this in a very determined way.
So very, very briefly, because as you can see, we need to start the next session, but your perspective on this and the European view.
Yeah, so I think it's not that Pompeo is necessarily wrong. There's a very live debate. By the way, Europe has been naive, and Europe is applying much more de-risking, including investment screening and other things, and is much more careful about certain technologies, which is not necessarily bad. However, just play out a different scenario. A scenario whereby the EU will face massive tariffs with the US market. It will not have the time to diversify. It faces a significant risk of recession at the point where it needs to fund its military. At that point, Europe will have no choice but to try to access the markets that it can access, and that will include China. So add to that the fact that the USAID cut, as well as the tariff facing Africa, will put Africa into a very, very difficult situation that poses both an immigration threat for Europe, as well as one of political instability in Africa. In that scenario, the West is losing out very quickly to Chinese companies, as well as Russian infiltration in Africa. So again, Europe is on the short end of that stick. So even if I don't fully agree with your analysis, and I think it's more complicated, and as a private sector, we apply de-risking strategies all the time, including when it comes to technology and including when it comes to Chinese technology, and we are very careful about that. If you're critical national infrastructure, you have to be absolutely ruthless around who sits on the control points and stuff like that. That being said, if I look at the painting and the dominoes, I'm actually worried that everything you said is going to be undermined by the actions that the Trump administration, for example, has taken on Africa, which is really, really, really devastating, and it has an indirect effect on Europe. By the actions that it's taking with respect to European economic development, because Europe is export dependent, in US is a really important market, and the domino that it will have on European policymakers having no choice but to actually seek additional export markets, which will include China, because you cannot ignore China if you have to diversify away from the US. So it's important to understand the indirect effect of other things if you want to have a discussion on China.